be talking to us about her forthcoming book, Before Krsna, Religious Diversity in Ancient India. Dr. Saxena specializes in ancient Indian history and her research interests include religion, art and inscriptions. She completed her BA and MA with a first position in the University of Delhi from Lady Shri Ram College and has been awarded the President's Gold Medal for excellence in academics, conduct, character and co-curricular activities. A PhD is also from the University of Delhi under the supervision of Professor Upinder Singh. She was awarded the Junior Research Fellowship by Indian Council of Historical Research. She has earlier also worked as a research associate at Aga Khan Foundation. She has been working as an assistant professor of history and has taught in LSR, Miranda House and Shivaji College. She is currently employed at LSR. Dr. Saxena has presented several research papers in national and international seminars. Her research articles such as the Ayaka Patas aura and symbol and image worship in Jainism, the Ayaka Patas of Mathura have been published in peer-reviewed journals such as the Art of the Orient and the Indian Historical Review respectively. A forthcoming publication titled Before Krsna, Religious Diversity in Ancient Mathura is scheduled for publication in February and is currently in print and will be available in stores from March onwards. It is published by Oxford University Press. She has also been working passionately for the last 20 years for the NGO Hridayashan and the Public Health Foundation of India and has represented India in several national and international conferences by World Health Organization and the American Public Association. We are grateful to ma'am for being with us today, and without much ado, we now request ma'am to kindly take over.
Thank you so much, Anushka. I would first like to thank Principal Ma'am, Lady Shri Ram College, my teachers at LSR. I'm so grateful who taught me so well and inculcated my love in history and my history department and the History Association. Now today I'll be talking about my book Before Krsna and the religious diversity in ancient Mathura. So first, the presentation would talk about the importance of Mathura, the sources and methodology I have used in my book, the issues that are being probed, a chapter-wise discussion, and the major findings and conclusions. Now, Mathura, as we all know, is synonymous with Vasudeva, Krishna. Even today, the spots around the landscape narrate the stories about the god. However, as the title of my book indicates, before Krsna, this landscape across these 15 centuries, between 3rd century BC and 12th century CE, reveals a multi-layered religious history of Mathura before it became synonymous with the worship of Vasudeva Krishna. Now, the fact that this landscape had a multi-religious character, right from the early historical till the early medieval period, raises many interesting questions. And these questions are not only relevant for these specific religious traditions, but also for understanding what was the nature of interactions between them on the same landscape. In addition, as we all know, Mathura is famed for being a school of sculpture. Major images of Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism have been carved out from the Mathura school of sculpture, and they continue to be the bedrocks for the Indian art and iconography. Now, my major source for analyzing the worship of the entire religious traditions in this landscape has been inscriptions from 3rd century BC to 12th century CE. Now, they are in a mixture of Sanskrit and Prakrit language, and some of them are written in Kharoshti, but mostly they are in the Brahmi script. Now, they have been found in and around the city of Mathura and the various mounds like Kamtali Tila, Isapur, Jamalpur, Katra. Now, the nature of these inscriptions, these are donative inscriptions. That is, they record various kinds of gifts, images, pillars, temples, Ayaka Patas, Shila Patas. Ayaka Patas are peculiar to Jainism. I'll be talking about these slabs in details. And their religious affiliations are known. Most of these donations are made by private individuals and few also by the royalty. Now, what is my methodology? I have looked at the material remains, which are largely archaeological, epigraphic, and sculptural, which have been found from in and around the Mathura city. Now, the inscriptions are understood with a statistical analysis where I identify the religions, cults, and sects in relation to the specific periods. In addition, the inscriptional data is understood in conjunction with possible literary sources. I have also probed in the epigraphic processes. How were the inscriptions perceived? The motives, the roles of composers, engravers, artists, and patrons. And as we all know that these inscriptions were actually documents of social and political legitimation, but most importantly, the sentiments of piety that are expressed in the religious sentiments are also being considered. Now, the major issue probed in the book is Dan. In fact, Dan is the main focus of the book and it runs across various religious traditions. The entire process of gift giving is expressed in the inscriptions through donations of images, temples. And the chapters that deal in the book, that is Jainism, Buddhism, Krishna and other deities, Yaksha and the Naga cults, Dan is the common thread that is running across all these various religious traditions. Every religion, whether you talk about Hinduism, Buddhism or Jainism, attempts to justify Dan and offers tempting rewards to the laity for undertaking these donations, and this is what the Mathura inscriptions talk about. Now, what is very significant to follow in the donative records from Mathura is an expressed and an inferred motive. Obviously, the inscriptions give you an expressed motive that you desire some merit. But there is also an inferred motive which is untold in the inscriptions, that you want to carve out a religious place in the community, or you want to carve out a social place for yourself in the community. Now, the book is not only a religious history, it's also social history. Donors across religious traditions are introduced within the kinship and occupational frameworks. We have a gender inscriptions because donations show larger preponderance of the woman. The role of monastic order in the life of laity is very, very important because the Jain and Buddhist inscriptions are flooded with the names of monks and nuns. And in case of Jainism, they're requesting the laity to donate, while in context of Buddhism, the monks and nuns emerge as donors in large numbers. Now, the donations also help us understand the nature of temples, stupas, and monasteries that are donated, which help us map what is the kind of religious activities happening in the public domain. And finally, the book talks about the nature of interactions between these various religious communities through a comparative analysis of the kinds of phrases, epithets, and patronage used across various religious traditions. Now, the Jainism chapter focusing on worshipping of stupa, Ayaka Patas, and images. Now, the peculiar aspect of Jain donative inscriptions, the kind of gifts that are being donated, the various modes of worship, that is stupa, images, and Ayaka Patas, dealing with the larger questions about the origin of the Jaina image. Why was it necessary to mention so many details of the monastic order in the inscriptions? And analyzing who were the Jains of Mathura. Do we have an answer to that? Were they Shvetambars or Dikambars? And finally, concluding why Jainism enjoys the continued presence on this landscape from 2nd century BC till the 12th century CE. Now, the peculiar aspect, as I said, I will begin with, is that the donative inscriptions are made by the laity at the request of monks and nuns, which indicates that the monastic order was intimately associated with the acts of donation. Now, was it obligatory to be advised by the laity in donations? There are a number of epithets attached to these monks and nuns. The epithets are the vachiks and the ganims, were special members of the Sangha entrusted with the task of just inducing the laity to donate. In addition, the monks and nuns are also mentioned along with the monastic units. The Ganas, Kulas, Shakhas, which is the school, the line of teachers, and the branches from which find out. Now, this indicates a well-organized Jain monastic order, which was very interesting to observe because in the limited space you had at your disposal, every monk and nun reiterates all the monastic order details on the inscriptions. Are the falakas. Now, the details are not only by the names, there are representations of Jain monks and nuns also in the sculptures. Now, these are a particular sect of monks which are only peculiar to Mathura. And as you see in the figure, they wear a cholapatta which they carry in the left arm. And they are depicted on the shilapatas, the stone slabs, and the Ayaga Patas, and also on the pedestals of the Jaina images. The first primary importance that we would be giving to Jainism is with regard to stupa and image worship. Now, what are the connotations when we talk about stupa and image worship in Jainism? In Jainism, stupas were built in memory of the Jain Tirthankars, and we have abundant examples from Mathura which establish that stupas were important objects of worship. When it comes to the image worship, it was referred to the laity that worship of any of the 24 Tirthankars is one of the obligatory duties that laity has to follow, and this was to a large extent expressed through the large number of donations that the laity were making. But with regard to the image worship in Jainism, the Tirthankar is there to imbibe the qualities, to be like the Tirthankar. That is why you worship images in Jainism. Very important site, because majority of the inscriptions, images, Ayaka Patas have been discovered from this site, not denying the fact that there's been Jain presence at other sites also in Mathura. In Kali Jiva, even more interesting is the nature of excavations at the site. Now, Führer is inseparable when it comes to Kankali Tila. He was the excavator of the site. And the problem was he did not furnish a published report, a detailed report. Whatever findings are there are in the museum report, and he abruptly left the scene. So another person was put in charge to compile whatever he had left. Now, there were questions raised about whatever is discovered, some aspects of it. And another problem was that there are lack of necessary details about the temples that were discovered here. Now, when we try to understand stupa worship of Mathura, we are understanding it through sculptural evidence, excavation report, inscriptional and literary sources, and finally we attempt to answer that the brick stupa that we have found at Mathura is the same that is mentioned as the Devanirmit, or the stupa built by the gods, in the inscription and the literary evidence. Now, these are the depictions of stupa worship. You can see the Toran, which is depicting the architecture of the Jain stupa clearly. In addition, on the Shila Patas, we have full depictions of Jain stupa, a beautiful Toran Aga Pata. And we also have these compendiums which show the worship of the stupa images and goddesses. And here, the monks and nuns venerate the Jain stupa. Now, we have been fortunate to find the remnants of a big stupa at Kankali Tila, which is dated to 5th and 4th century BC. And why we are confident it's a Jain stupa is because most of the images, the Ayaka Patas, Shilavitas, Jaina images, have been found in and around the stupa area. Now, from Führer excavations, we have definitely been able to recover the plans and the brick structure. Now, another clinching evidence is an inscription from Kankali Tila, datable the 3rd century CE, which records the donation of an image of Munisuvrat at a Devanirmit stupa, that is a stupa built by the gods, by Shravika Dina at the request of Vachik Aryavriddhahaste, who belonged to the Koteya Gana and the Vera Shaka. Now, this clearly indicates that there were a lot of interactions happening between the ascetic and the laity while the donations were being made. Also, a stupa complex existed at Mathura, which shows the worship of the images and the stupas. Now, this Devanirmit stupa also occurs in the literary references in the text Yashastakala Champu and Vivid Tirtha Kalpa by the same name Devanirmit existing at Mathura. Now, stated simply, the question was the brick stupa discovered at Kankali Tila was the same stupa that is mentioned in the inscription and the literature. Now, it's difficult to assume so, because even if we are relying on the inscriptional and literary evidence alone, there is another set of evidence which refers to 5 Mathura. We have found innumerable gateways and railings which clearly indicate that perhaps more than one stupa existed at Mathura. In addition, what we concluded is definitely there is a brick stupa at Mathura, which traces the origin of stupa worship in Jainism fairly early. We had also a stupa by the name Devanirmit that existed at Mathura, where images and stupas were worshipped together, but whether the two were same is difficult to establish. We have also found 2 temples at Kankali Tila, where Führer confidently said that one belonged to the Shwetambar, but other belonged to the Digambars. Now, as you all know that there has been a larger discussion about the division between these 2 sects. that Shvetambars were clothed white, where Digambars were used to be moving around naked. Now here, we have a very significant evidence of an inscriptions which refers to the Shvetambar Sangha. But the Digambar temple, which Firo mentions, is nowhere to be occurring in the Mathura inscription. The images that we have found are all nude, which could have belonged to both the sects, but the Digambar epigraphic presence is missing. Now, when we try to analyze these large number of donative inscriptions of Jainism, we also established that the earliest gifts, that is datable from 2nd century BC, are associated with temples in Mathura. The most popular gifts from 2nd century BC to 11th century CE across these 133 inscriptions are images. We also have a peculiar gift, which are the Ayaka Patas. Now, the Ayaka Patas were these stone slabs, which had an image of a Jaina, or they had a stoop, or they had an auspicious symbol which was related to Jainism carved on them. It simply meant an object of homage, and Pata meant a slab. Together, it was understood as a Jain tablet of worship. Shilapatas were the stone slabs. Now, I have divided the Ayaka Patas and Shilapatas on the basis of the modes of worship they depict. So, you have a symbol Ayaka Pata in which you would have a Dharma Chakra. You would have a Jaina image Ayaka Pata in which the center would be having a Jaina image. You have Stupa Ayaka Patas where the depiction of a stoop would be on the slab, and you would have a figural Ayaka Pata, that you would have a major figure of a goddess overarching. Now, what are the functions? First of all, we are not locating any Buddhist parallels. These were peculiar to Jainism alone. They are not mentioned in literature. The inscriptions and the fine strokes of these Ayaka Patas indicates that they were installed in vihars and temples. They were set up for the worship of arhats, and they record invocation to Tirthankars. So in all these contexts, they were clearly objects of worship. Now, there are different facets of Jain worship that are noticeable. First, they depict the Jaina image and stoop being worshipped together. They talk about the iconography, they reflect the iconographic practices. The inscriptions and the sculptural depiction reveal the popular worship of Mahavir in comparison to Parshvanath. Now, worship of the Jaina and stoop is depicted in this particular slab. You have Tirthankar images usually carved seated, as you see with the closer image of the Ayaka Pata from 1st century BC. Now, as we move towards the 1st century CE, you have additions in iconography. You have an umbrella carved over the head. And you also have certain iconographic practices being established very early on these slabs. For example, the 23rd Tirthankar Parshvanath is carved with snake canopy holes. Now, this practice is noticeable on an Ayaka Pata slab where you see the two Ardhafalak monks flanking the Parshvanath with the same snake canopy holes as early as 1st century BC CE. Now, the Ardhafalaks were also associated with the Ayaka Patas and Shilapatas. In the Parshvanath image, they are flanking. In addition, we had the full slab depicting an Ardhafalak monk. So, probably they were venerated also. Now, what is significant is that we usually discard a sacred object. But in context of Ayaka Pata, we notice a reuse because some of them were recarved into images. However, there is no example after 3rd century CE at Mathura. And it has been suggested that because the Jaina images were carved in the round, they were discontinued as objects of worship. However, from 1st to 4th century CE, which marks the pinnacle of the donation of Jaina images at Mathura, we still have donation of Ayaka Patas. Around 4 were donated. In addition, even when you're looking at objects of donation, Ayaka Patas could never outnumber the images during their peaks also. However, Ayaka Patas as a whole did not survive after 3rd century CE, but the Ashtamangalas on the Ayaka Patas which are depicted on the borders here, continued to be depicted on the pedestals. You see a Dharma Chakra below on the pedestal. And the Jaina images, which were carved, seated, cross-legged in Dhyan Mudra, they became the independent images in the round. So Ayaka Patas were sources of inspirations for all these things. Now, images were the most popular objects of donation at Mathura. Now, they do not refer to the term Jaina or Tirthankar. The reference is to Arhats and Pratima. The earliest donation of a Jaina image is the pre-Kushan period, and then they continue without an interruption to the early medieval period, with a pinnacle between 1st to 4th century CE. Now, the inscriptions clearly reveal popular worship of various Tirthankars, which are epigraphically identifiable as Mahavir, Rishabhnath, Sambhavnath, Sumatinath, and the patterns of donation reveal order and the laity on the pedestals. Now, we Shravakars and the Shravikas are fully clothed, they are carrying flower containers, while the monks and nuns, without any ornaments, they carry a radhor and a whisk broom that is there. And obviously, we have the Ardhafalas. Now, there's also an interesting observation that the pedestal of Tirthankar images would have all these depictions, whereas the goddesses are just carved with adoration of two figures. In addition, pedestals are assumed to be objects recording their donations, but they also emerge as object of donations independently, as we have a 3rd century CE record from Mathura, which records that an image and a pedestal were donated together. Now, when we analyze the Jain donative inscriptions over this long period, clearly there are larger issues that concern Jainism also becomes very imperative. First of all, the primary reference point for images worship is usually Buddhism, and Jainism is neglected. However, we need to take into account the origin of Jain images fairly early on the Ayaka Patas. Stups are also always understood with regard to Buddhist parallels, but clearly at Mathura, the evidence is concrete enough to establish that they worship the stups fairly early. When we talk about the donors, both men and women are donors here, and they are introduced within occupational and familial line. Now, some of the donors also derive their identity from the native places also. What's interesting is that the women donors clearly outnumber the male donors at Mathura. And they're referred as the daughters, daughter-in-laws, wives, with maximum references to wives followed by daughters and daughter-in-laws. Now, what is very interesting is that the male donors are also introduced around the kinship and the familial lines, but they do not mention their wives or daughters, they would mention only their sons. Also, the occupation is another identity for these donors. Now, here what is very significant to understand is that we are looking at the fact that there is the male donors whose occupations are mentioned, and the female donors are also mentioning the occupations of the male members of the family. So in either case, we are only getting to know what the male members were doing. So there are various occupations, the Shrishtin, the Lohikara, the Hiranya, the Sethi, the Manikara, all of them are being mentioned in inscription. Now, what's prestige attached to mentioning all these occupations, and the donors are mentioning along with their family members. It indicates it was important to record them for posterity. Now, monks and nuns are very significant. They are mentioned along with the epithets. They mention the Gana, Kula, and Shaka. They outnumber the nuns in requesting the laity to donate. In addition, the Koteya Gana, the Varan Gana, they are repeated references, and it is significant to note that teacher-student pairs are mentioned together. Probably laity was also belonging to the same Ganas. How was the Jain order that we are looking at was explicit in giving so many details about the monastic order. Now, purposes of donation. Now, they nowhere mention merit or punya. What is very significant is that this is because the members of the family are mentioned, probably they all had a share in merit. Finally, can we say who were the Jains at Mathura, Shwetambar or Digambar? The Ganas, Kulas, and Shakas that are mentioned, they also occur in a Shwetambar text called Kalpa Sutra. Now, what is significant is that we are not saying that they were recorded because they are mentioned in the Kalpa Sutra. It's a widespread practice which came to be recorded both in the inscriptions and in the text. The issue of nudity is another factor. Now, all the images that are there are nude. So we cannot establish on the basis of that they belong to either sect. The two inscriptions help us establish that definitely there is a Shwetambar Sangha that existed at Mathura in the early medieval period. We are not denying that there was no Digambar presence. Probably there were a lot of Digambar presence, and both the nude images were worshipped alike. So what is significant to note through this entire discussion is that Jainism enjoyed a continual presence at Mathura from the early historical till the early medieval period through these various modes of worship, that is Stup, Jinnah image, and the Ayaka Patas. Coming to my next chapter, that is Buddhism. Now, here we argue first and foremost that Mathura should be acknowledged as a very significant Buddhist site. The various type of gifts, Buddha, Bodhisattvas, the Bodhisattva images preceding, and the epigraphic references to monastic schools and vihars at Mathura and the nature of patronage. Now, the Buddhist donative inscriptions are from 2nd century till the 6th century CE, and Mathura needs to be acknowledged as a Buddhist site. I mean, because it is not under the structure similar to Barhut and Sanchi, that superstructure is lacking, because of which you have abundant references to Mathura on monographs and art and iconography, but it is missing when it comes to the references to Buddhist sites. One cannot ignore that Mathura was on the itineraries of the travelogues of the Chinese pilgrims. In addition, the Buddhist epigraphs, they refer to numerous vihars, Buddha and Buddhist images. So the evidence is substantial to accord it as an important Buddhist site. Now, as in Jainism, here the peculiar aspect is that they were made for the acceptance of schools, sects and teachers. In addition, what is significant to note is that Buddhist inscriptions refer to punya or merit. Now here, the monks and nuns emerge as donors in large numbers. In addition, the earliest references to vihar occur with regard to Buddhism. Now, the earliest Buddhist gifts we have are the pillars, the stone bowls and the toran. And the Buddhist sites, importantly, are Jamalpur, which record existence from 2nd century till 6th century CE. And this is the stone bowl that was donated at the Vihar of the goldsmiths at 2nd century BC. It is the earliest reference to a Vihar. In addition, the most important has been the Mathura land capital. Now, this record has been very important because it was donation of a stup and a monastery. But what is very significant is, while the innumerable Mathura inscriptions of Buddhism record installations of gifts in Vihar, it records a Sangharam, a term only used here for a Vihar, which indicates it was a bigger Vihar that was being donated. This is the Mathura land capital. In addition, we have always focused on understanding this period from 1st century BC to CE through the Mathura land capital. However, what is very significant is that this period also records the donation of Bodhisattva images, which clearly establishes that the Bodhisattva images were carved before the Buddha images at Mathura. And in addition, the Buddha images are outnumbering the Bodhisattva images, but there is donation of pillar bases also in large numbers, which have not received due attention. And these pillar bases are very, very important because they are installed in the Huvishka Vihar. That is, this Vihar was established by the Kushan king Huvishka. There is a neat organization, there are monastic orders being associated with the establishment of this Vihar. These are the Bodhisattva images and the Buddha images that are being donated at Mathura. Images were clearly the most popular objects donated by the Buddhists at Mathura. In addition, we had miniature stups, we have narratives about life of Buddha. But clearly, when it comes to weighing stup and image worship, the Buddha images were the most popularly worshipped objects. When we come to the donors, they're introduced on the same lines as the Jain donors. You have them deriving their familial and kinship occupations, but here male donors occur more frequently than the female donors. In addition, the occupations that are mentioned are not confined to the donors alone, although there are overlap of donations that we'll be discussing towards the conclusion. You have the same goldsmith, caravan merchants being mentioned, the Shrestins being mentioned. But what is significant with regard to Buddhism is that the occupations occur more frequently with regard to the vihars or the monasteries. And there is no reference to any occupation with regard to the pillar bases. When it comes to the monastic order is actively donating at Mathura. In fact, the lay donations were made along with the monastic order. Some of the gifts were donated to the Sangha installed in the vihars. Monks as donors outnumber the nuns also. And they are mentioned with special epithets. Some of them derive their identity from the vihars. Some of them mention that they were belonging to specific schools like Sarvastivadin, Mahasangika. Some of them even mention their knowledge of the Tipitaka that is being specified in the inscriptions. No special epithets are attached to the names of the nuns when it comes to the Buddhist order, although one of the nuns is said to be proficient in the Tipitaka. That is the only reference we have. In addition, we have the Sangha Pratakas and the Sanghastavidas. Clearly, these were the people who were associated with the Sangha. The monastic order was definitely very vibrant here because the vihars emerged very early. 2nd century BC till 6th century CE, majority of the gifts are installed in the vihars. We record donation of the few vihars. Some of the monks are identifying themselves on the basis of their vihars. There are various vihars based on occupation. You have goldsmith vihar, the vihars of the cloak makers. The Jamalpur mound is very significant because most of the pillar bases have been found at the vihar that is believed to have been situated at Jamalpur. Now, this mound is also interesting for understanding the threads of interaction because we also have a Naga inscription that refers to a shroud of Krsna that is being donated here. So all these details definitely help us understand that Buddhism definitely was in a very vibrant form existing at Mathura. Now, no book or discussion is ever complete on Mathura without referring to the cult of Vasudeva Krishna. And here what I focused on is understanding the amalgamation of all sources and how this cult actually evolved at Mathura before this place becoming completely synonymous with the worship of Vasudeva Krishna. Now here we have my primary source, that is the two inscriptions which refer to Vasudeva and the Vrishani heroes here. Now they record the installation of the images in a Shaila Devagraha, a stone temple, and a Mahasthan as early as 1st century BC CE. Now this clearly established that the site was fairly known and accounted to the worship of Vasudeva. And the patronage though is very little because we just have these two inscriptions, but this patronage is significant to note because this patronage was considerably rich. This inscription records the Mahasthana of Vasudeva. In addition, I have tried to understand the Vasudeva Krishna worship through sculptures. First the sculpture slabs, then the independent images of Balaram and Vasudeva Krishna, and the depiction of the family of Balaram, Krishna and Ekanamsha. Now here, this cultural relief is very, very important because it shows that Vasudeva was carrying baby Krishna when everybody was sleeping across the Yamuna river. Now this indicates the acquaintance and the familiarity with this popular story at Mathura. And this particular slab, which is depicting this story, also occurs in a very important literary reference, which is early, which is the Bhasa's play, Balacharita, which is dated to 1st to 2nd century CE, which indicates that the people were familiar with the kind of stories which were enacted in the plays also. In addition, there are independent images of Balaram and Krishna. Balaram is obviously predating, you have 2nd century BC, and Vasudeva Krishna sculptures as across the Indian subcontinent are noticeable from Gupta period onwards. You have the 2nd century BC image of Balaram, whereas you have the depictions of Vasudeva Krishna Leelas also, which are there, the Kalyanaga Leela, and also the sculpture showing him lifting the Govardhan mountain. Now these triads depict actually the family, that is Balaram, Ekanamsha and Vasudeva Krishna. Now this indicates that the family was also being worshipped at Mathura, and it indicates that Mathura was familiar with not only the worship of Vasudeva Krishna but the Balaram and the family. And these triads are also understood because of their sizes that probably they were associated with household worship. So when we understand this amalgamation of all kinds of sources, clearly we have to understand that as early as 1st century BC CE, this site was acquainted with the worship of Vasudeva. In addition, it is noticeable to depict the worship, the life stories, the Leelas of Vasudeva Krishna, and there is absence of inscriptions in this period, and it is primarily, we believe, from the early medieval period onwards when these Bengali Goswamis actually settled in Mathura. They produced a lot of literature and made every spot at Mathura being associated with the stories of this god. Now, also very important part of the discussion on Mathura has been some few sets of inscriptions which talks about various Hindu gods and goddesses, the Shiva, Vishnu, Durga, Shri Lakshmi and Varaha. Now this here we also argue that Song was perhaps a very important site which record worship of Hindu gods and goddesses, just as the way we are acknowledging Kankali Tila and Jamalpur. In a similar way we have to acknowledge Song, which acknowledges the worship of not only the Matraka cult but also the Naga cult and the role of Brahmins also. Now here when we talk about worship of Shiva, Definitely, there are the lingers being discovered, a very early references to Shiva temples, tanks and gardens. And in addition, what is significant to note is by the Gupta period, we have an inscription that records the installation of Guru Ayatana, the memorials of the two Acharya, which belongs to the Lakulish sect, and there is a warning given, which indicates that perhaps there was some tension that anybody tried to disrupt this memorial will invite great sins. So these are the reliefs showing the worship of the Shivalinga, and this is that recording the installation of by Uditacharya with the Lakulish figure also. We also have worship of Kartikeya, and the most significant aspect about this Kartikeya worship is that this inscription records that this image was donated in a house. So we are looking at these three brothers recording this donation of the image of Kartikeya to be installed in their house. These are the Kartikeya images that we have. Now we have juxtaposed this evidence with the discoveries at Sonk. Now Sonk has given us the first metal images in bronze, and which are of Kartikeya, which have also been found in the houses in or around the excavation area. Now this corroborates the evidence that is there in the inscription. In addition, if you are looking at a metal image, definitely we are looking at a particular community, an elite community worshipping this cult. We've also found a Matrika temple at Sonk, and we have found Mahishasur Mardini images in and around the temple, which establishes that a Matrika temple also existed at Sonk very early, from 1st century CE onwards. In addition, the inscriptions also help us understand how Vishnu, Shri and Varaha were worshipped. Now, the worship of Vishnu is also noticed in this independently. The incarnations are there, Vasudeva, Krsna and Varaha. The first reference to Vishnu is fairly late, which occurs in 12th century CE. Now, we've discovered also an inscription which talks about a stone slab that is carved with the images of Shri, apart from donating a number of other gifts, that is tanks, gardens and pillars. The Varaha image is equal to the Kushan period. And Brahmins. Now, Brahmins emerge in three forms. They emerge as donors, they emerge as endowments being made in their favor, and also some sacrifices conducted by them. What is significant to note is that the constant occurrence of the Brahmins in royal establishments. Finally, the last chapter talks about the Yakshas and the Nagas that are being worshipped at Mathura. Now, this is the oldest foci of worship we have. Now, we argue that we cannot dub them on the basis of evidence at Mathura as merely folk cults. We have independent images, sculptures, inscriptions, a temple at Sonk, and the Naga donative inscriptions, which are carved and written down with same sophistication as the Buddhist and the Jain epigraphs. Now, Yakshas, as you know, the earliest foci of worship of Mathura, 3rd century BC. What is significant to note is that they record the names of Yaksha Manibhadra, Yaksha a Kuber image recorded by Yaksha, and also the recording the names of this. We also have Kuber images that we have found. Now, this inscription is particularly significant because it refers to the Deva Prasad. Now, Prasad is a very modern term, and the expected result or merit is not mentioned, but it is said that it indicates the gift of the god to the worshipper. Now, all the donors of the Yaksha images are male, and they're introduced in the same kinship lines. The Naga worship is attested not only through sculptures, inscriptions, but also through a temple. And while we have sculptures as early as 2nd century BC, we have Naga inscriptions from 1st century till the 3rd century CE, which indicates that at the time the Buddhists and Jains were donating, the Naga cult was also flourishing. Now here we have a temple, a Shilapata tank garden being donated. We record various names of the Naga deities. The Dhadikarna is mentioned as the lord of Nagas. We have male donors, no female donors are mentioned here also. And the purposes are to please the Naga deities. These are some of the Naga images that we have discovered. Now the temple at Sonk is very, very significant because it makes you question that whether these were a mere folk cult, and the discoveries in and around the temples indicate that it was carved by skilled artists. These are some of the sculptural depictions that we have found at Sonk. This is a court scene that we have discovered. So these surface finds also we have found at Song, which is interesting, which shows that the character of this place also was very much Naga. But what is the belief by the villagers at Mathura is that whatever is found on the surface actually belongs to them. So this Naga image that was found was taken away by the villagers, and it was sculpted and is still worshipped today in the temple as Chamunda Devi. And you can clearly see when you photograph that image closely that it is a Naga image from the snake canopy hoods. So what do we conclude? Definitely from the analysis of Yaksha and Naga cults, we see that we cannot dub them as mere folk cults. The earliest foci of worship is there. They are worshipping their gods with the same sophistication as others. The discovery of the temple and the fact that their donations are regarded in the same way as the Jain and Buddhist make us question whether these really a folk cult at Mathura or not. So, concluding my major findings that I have understood through analyzing these donative 293 inscriptions, first and foremost, at Mathura, the majority of gifts that were being donated are objects or places of worship. So these are images, stupas, temples, Ayaka Patas, Shila Patas, and all were donated by all religious traditions except the Ayaka Patas, which were peculiar to the Jains alone. The earliest gifts donated were the images, and they occur in the context of a folk cult, the Yakshas, which is true for most of the areas of the Indian subcontinent. The earliest temples in this area belong to Jainism, Shaivism, and the Vasudeva temple. So this place had an early presence of Vasudeva. The earliest monasteries or vihars are with regard to Buddhism. Images emerge as the most popular objects of donation, and this is very relevant for the religious traditions also, because origin of the Buddha image is the primary reference point for talking about image worship. Now here, clearly the Yaksha images are the earliest. Secondly, the origin of the image worship needs to be understood with regard to Jainism also, where they were worshipped fairly early on the Ayaka Patas, and in addition, with regard to Buddhism also, the worship of Bodhisattva. The stup worship, definitely we need not locate any Buddhist parallels. The Jains worship the stup as much as the Buddhists did. What's interesting also to derive at the nomenclature and the names of various deities. While the Jains initially referred to them as Nirgranthas, we have the Shvetamba presence from the early medieval period also. The Buddhists were identifying themselves on the basis of various schools like Sarvastivadins, Mahasangikas. And the identification is also noticeable very early from the Yaksha cults, which are referring to themselves as the Yaksha and the Yakshis, the Manibhadra Yaksha, the Graha Yaksha. Also, we get to know the names of the various Tirthankars, the Bodhisattvas, Avalokiteshwar Bodhisattva, the Amitabh and the Kashyap Buddha is there. The Shiva is mentioned through Maheshwar, gender names. The Vasudeva is the term and not Krsna that's occurring in the inscriptions. Vishnu occurs fairly early, late, that is 12th century CE, and Ganesh is also mentioned in that particular inscriptions. What is interesting is that the landscape was not only acquainted with the images and their names, the narratives around that. At Mathura, the story of Vasudeva carrying Krishna is fairly early. The various leelas associated with Krishna are depicted. In addition, for Jainism, you have scenes of Rishabhnath being carved. Buddhism is replete with scenes of Buddha's demise. And also you have the Nagamesh deity in Jainism, which was associated with birth of children. Clearly, when it comes to the narrative scenes, you also have to take into account that the Nagas and the Naganis are also depicting their court scenes on the various slabs. When we look at the entire picture of the donors, the lay donors, clearly there are detailed information about them. We are looking at them introduced around the same lines, that is kinship and occupation. Now, Mathura inscriptions narrate the history of community more than royalty, as very few donations are made by the kings and the queens. The gender preponderance is there, although men are the earliest donors, but clearly the women outnumber them across religious tradition. However, there are differences, like in Jainism there are more women donors, while in Buddhism they're nearly equal. The men donors actually are ahead of the women donors. Occupation continues to be the basis of identity. There is an overlap when it comes to both Jainism and Buddhism. If you talk about the mercantile occupations, the goldsmiths, and in either case, the male members' occupations are noticeable to us. The epigraphs also make due references to Kshatriyas, Kayasthas, and Brahmins. The names of monks and nuns, the inscriptions are flooded with their names. And we get to know about the monastic order also, that they were associated with the acts of donation in context of Jainism, whereas in Buddhism, they emerged as large numbers as the donors, so they were probably flouting the rules of the Buddhist canon also. In addition, Kalpa Sutra as a text does not occur while Tipitaka, which is an important Buddhist text, is mentioned in the inscriptions. Also, the Buddhist monks and nuns are donating along with their parents, indicating that their familial ties were not entirely broken even after joining the Sangha. Merit is very important. The punya that is there, it is occurring in the Buddhist, Shaiva and Vaishnava inscriptions. It does not occur in the Jaina native inscription. The language of piety, that is explicitly you talk about the inferred motive that you have to derive. The sculptors and the engravers and the composers of inscriptions are also mentioned. The sculptors occur 3rd century BC. The composers of the inscriptions occur from 5th century, and they are noticeable also in the 7th and 12th century CE. Now, what is interesting to observe is, when we finally conclude, that Jainism enjoyed the maximum presence on this landscape from 2nd century BC to 11th century CE. Also, we have to understand that probably different religions perceived Mathura differently. For Jains, it was a site they had to come and pay pilgrimage to. For Buddhists, probably residence of monks and nuns. For Song, the Hindu worship also being very relevant apart from the Naga cults. So it was clearly a shared landscape by different religious tradition. And the excavations at Som, because we've tried to understand it through the structural remains, reveal a Matraka temple and a Naga temple, which are associated with a distance of 400 meters. In addition, at Jamalpur Mound, you had a Buddhist mound, and also there must have been sources of tensions. Definitely we are looking at these epigraphs mentioning that you would invite great sins. But overall, to conclude this entire landscape, before it became synonymous with the worship of Vasudeva Krishna, it was very much acknowledging a multi-religious history where all these religious traditions were sharing and interacting with each other. So we're not here to understand them as watertight compartments, but acknowledging their significance on the basis of the footprints they left on the soil of Mathura before this site became synonymous with worship of Vasudeva Krishna. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for sharing your time with us and delivering this wonderful lecture. It was informative and deeply insightful. We would now like to open the floor for discussion. If anyone has any questions or anything you'd like to share, please unmute your mic. You can also type it in the chat box and we will read it out.
Ma'am, I had a question. Ma'am, like you said that there was changes in the name. Name was changed from to Vishnu Vasudeva. So, ma'am, can we really say that even the form was changed and there was attributes which